second scripture today is from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 1 to 11. Now, concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were enticed and led astray to idols that could not speak. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God ever says, "Let Jesus be cursed," and no one can say, "Jesus is Lord," except by the Holy Spirit. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of services, but the same Lord. There are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the discernment of spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All of these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, the charismatic movement was really big in Pittsburgh, where I was a teenager. And I made my real commitment to following Jesus as part of a charismatic Lutheran church in my section of the city. And at that point in time, and when I went away to college, I believed that was the only authentic expression of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. I believed that. And that kind of worldview, that theology was central for me. The discussion of gifts was a very, very important discussion in those circles. And I remember sitting with some of my friends and talking, and the question was, well, which gift do you have? We took seriously that they were allocated to each person as the Spirit saw fit. And so we believed that everyone had one of those. And we believed that list that I read there from Paul of 9 different gifts was an exhaustive list. That those were the 9 things the Spirit gave, and every true believer had at least one of them. You just had to figure out which one. And of course, in those days and in those circles, the default one was always speaking in tongues, because anybody could do that. Or at least that was how we thought of it. We believed that without the operation of that list of 9 gifts, the church wasn't the church. And it was that simple for us. Well, I've had a lot of water go under the dam since then, and my theology, my practice of faith, my understanding of the church, my understanding of human psychology, all of those things have changed since then. And so I read this passage in a completely different way than I did back in those days. But I have to say that whenever this passage comes up, it always kind of spooks me. And it popped up in the lectionary this week. And I read the passages, and I really wanted to preach on making wine. That just made me happy, made me smile. You've all seen my cup that says, "Give me coffee to change the things I can, and Pinot to endure the things I can't." And look back at my database, and sure enough, in my 40 years of preaching, I had never once preached on this passage. Because every time I read it, I go right back to those high school days and those discussions, sitting there with my friends and saying, "Well, which gift do you have?" "I have," and off we went. So I decided this past week, a couple of weeks, a month or so ago, I'm going to wrestle with it this time for the first time ever. And so you get to hear that. And you can decide whether it was giftedness or something else altogether. Let me start with what I don't believe anymore. I don't believe this was an exhaustive list. And I don't think Paul thought it was an exhaustive list. I think, we'll get back to that later. So I don't believe that. I don't believe that the gifts of the Spirit are necessarily supernatural in any way that we would use that term today. When Paul talks about gifts of healing, I think if he was here today, he might have gone to the hospital with one of us, and he would point at those physicians and those nurses and those nurse practitioners and those physician's assistants, and he'd say, that's the gift of healing right there. Right there. Here's one that probably would have been most radical to me back in those days. I don't believe the gifts are given only to Christians. I believe the Spirit of God apportions the gifts that God gives to everyone. There's a place in Matthew where Jesus says, God makes the sun shine on the just and the unjust, makes the rain fall on the unjust and the just. And I think that applies to gifts as well. The Spirit apportions the gifts that the Spirit gives to folk even if they don't want them, don't know about them, don't care about them, don't believe in God as far as they could throw me. All of that, the Spirit still gifts people. So when we come to the passage, the Corinthian church had some serious problems. And they're not unexpected problems. They're not unexplainable problems. They didn't know how to be this new community of faith, this beloved community, when the values of Jesus were so radically different than the values that they had lived under and understood. So radically different than the culture around them. All of the walls that they took for granted were gone. Used to be a separation between Jew and Greek, between male and female, between slave and free, between rich and poor, rural and urban. All of that disappears in Jesus. All of those walls are gone. They didn't know how do you structure a world where all of a sudden those barriers are missing. Wealthy folk had always assumed that they were blessed because God was on their side. And now all of a sudden they've got these teachings from Jesus that says the rich and the poor are going to be turned upside down, and the first will be last and the last will be first, and they didn't know how to make sense out of that. They might have been sitting in their worship gathering one Sunday, and a woman stood up. Women don't speak in public. And even when they do, we don't take them very seriously. And all of a sudden, they were in a new community that said, no. She's got something to say. Y'all better listen. Worse than a woman, you might show up one day, and the slave is standing there, preaching the sermon. And the slave's owner is sitting in the chair listening. This isn't right. This isn't right. They didn't know how to make sense out of this new way of being. They didn't have an awareness of how you live in a world where the normal circles of class and culture are disappeared. We kid ourselves that we don't have those things here, and we do have them less than some other places. The funniest experiences when we were in India with Alexis, and everyone would talk to us, and you could almost read their mind. They were trying to figure out, now, if you were Indian, what caste would you be? So I know how I'm allowed to talk to you. Yeah. And we think, everybody's the same in the United States. Well, yeah. we all know better than that if we really think about it, don't we? I still remember the time we were in the really high-end art store on the New Jersey shore. And I had an experience as a middle-class white boy that I had never had before. The person followed me and watched me. Everything I did. She wanted to be sure I didn't pick something up, because this wasn't, even middle-class white boys didn't go there. One of my African-American friends wouldn't have gotten in the door. We do have those things, but not nearly as in some other places. And so those Corinthians, they retreated to a system they understood. Hierarchy and power. Now, they shook out these layers in a new way. Well, yeah, we know we can't separate Jews from Greeks anymore, but we can separate discerners of spirits from tongue speakers. And we can separate utterances of supernatural wisdom from utterances of knowledge. We can do that, and I know which one I have, and it's better than yours. And then they fought over that. They fought over which order. They didn't fight over whether or not you could have an order. They fought over which one goes on top. Not whether there's a top. They assumed that. That's the way the world works, they said. That's the way the world works. And if this gift is the most important, then because I have it, I must be the most important. God must like me best. And so Paul responds to them, and he writes them, and I think the list of gifts he has here, because those are the ones they were talking about the most. And so he just picks them right up and puts them right out there. They were the things they were fighting about. Okay, let me tell you, God gives all of those things as God wants. And if you think you can figure out why God gave you this gift and not that gift, then you're a better apostle than I am. But the primary piece that he underscores here, primary pieces are that first off, the Spirit gifts everyone. Second off, the gifts, we see this in the rest of the book, that are least exciting are actually the ones that are most important. But the most important piece of his advice to them is you need to know that all of the gifts are given for the common good. God doesn't give you anything, he says, except to use it for others. And if you have one of the sexy gifts and you think that makes you somehow special, well, that just makes you more of a servant. More of a servant. And so, as I was wrestling with that this week, I really began to see that the gifts are not only for use in the church, because God's yearnings don't end at those walls, at those boundaries. God's yearnings are for the entire world, that all of us will know the blessings of God's gifts, of God's grace. And so all of the gifts are given so that all of the world might become everything that God yearns for it to be. And then I began to think of my sermon last week about our call, and how our call and our gifts are related, and that if each of us has a call, and most of them were, if we wanted to use that term, they were secular, right? But our gifts are given so that we might fulfill the calls that God has placed on our lives in a more efficient and effective way. And always our call and our gifts are aimed at pouring ourselves out for others. Now, we live in a country, in a society where common good is not often at the forefront, is it? We have politicians whose primary concern is getting reelected, and much more worried about that than they are about serving their constituency, and they're worried more about serving their constituency than they are about contributing to the common good and helping this nation become its best dreams. You can fill in the blanks however you want there. We have business people who are more worried about the bottom line than they are their workers. One of my favorite stories from back in Pennsylvania is one we heard on a tour in Hershey, Pennsylvania, about Milton Hershey. And back during the Great Depression, Hershey was actually doing well enough, his company, chocolate company, that they were building. They were building a factory. And he was there watching the building, and one of the construction floor people came to him and said, "Mr. Hershey, see that machine there? That machine can do the work of 20 people." He was proud. He was excited. He thought, we're saving money. We've got this amazing technology that does these wonderful things. And Hershey was aghast. He said, "Turn it off." "What do you mean?" "Turn it off." But turn it off. And then go hire 20 people. When I heard that story, first I was astounded that a business person would think like that. And then I was astounded that a business person would think like that. This past week you may have seen the meme that was going around about a Little Caesar's pizza shop in Fargo, North Dakota, where the manager learned that there were folk who were picking through the trash bin to find partially eaten pizza. And the person put a sign on the door that said, "Please don't do that. You're a human being. You shouldn't be picking through the trash. Come in and we'll give you a couple of slices of pizza and a cup of water." And it went viral. Why in the world should that go viral? Well, first, we're surprised that a business person would do that. But we're not surprised that there are people who need it. And we have an economic system that literally requires some people to be needy. Some people have to be out of work for our economy to function. You realize that, right? When we're down to 3% unemployment, and they talk about that being full employment unless you're one of the 3%. And then it's not at all. And those folk who are out of work, who we require with our economic system that somebody has to be out of work, then we act as if they're morally deficient because they're fulfilling a necessary role in our society. And at the same time, we make it more and more difficult for them to get necessities like medical care. We sell weapons to hot spots around the world, and then we're surprised when refugees come knocking on our doors. We refuse to take responsibility for damage to the planet, and at the same time continue to take resources from future generations. All the while, those who benefit most from the society use the system to further enhance their positions of power. Okay. As I was going through all of that, I thought, man, Roy, you're getting cynical again. This is California. We don't do that here. And there is the other side, isn't there? You know, when I was in New York and I only wore black because they didn't have anything darker. I would have stopped there. But the reality is that we have been given amazing gifts from the Spirit. We sit in a tradition, in a history of men and women who planted the seeds of a more excellent union. They didn't understand it. They didn't envision everything that would mean, but they tended those seeds and they watered them and they fed them, and it began to grow. And it grew in ways they didn't expect and didn't envision. But the dream was implicit all along. We've had leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who we celebrate this week, willing to risk and give their lives so that this nation might fulfill those dreams, which in its most excellent form conform to God's yearnings for us. We have freedoms that others around the world envy. We have wealth in this nation that provides amazing opportunities. We have technological wonders that have transformed human life. And however bad we might be sometimes, this is still the place almost everybody wants to go. Because of all of those things. I have a Muslim friend who immigrated to the United States from Egypt. And we were talking about life in the United States, and he was very quick to tell how difficult it is to be a Muslim in the United States. But this day, he was talking about something else, and he said, freedom of religion is a genius idea. Nobody else does it like the United States. It's amazing. He said, because I come here as a Muslim, and I can be the best Muslim that I've ever been. And indeed, I can be the best Muslim. I can be a better Muslim here than I could in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else. Because I have the freedom to seek God. And you know what? You can be the best Christian you can be here. Better than you can be anywhere else. Because you have the freedom to seek God. And this other person over here who's an atheist, they can do that the very best they can too. And so all of us end up being richer and fuller and more whole people because of that freedom. It's genius. It's genius. We have an economic engine, the likes of which the world has never seen. Yes, it is founded on the backs of slaves, indentured servants, and indigenous people, and fueled by taking resources from the earth that maybe we shouldn't be taking, but we are where we are. And the reality is that that economic engine can make life better for everybody in the world. And indeed, we have. We have already. And above all of that, I maintain that we in this United States are still a people of heart, of compassion, and of generosity. Often, our better angels are overcome by fear, but the better angels are still there, waiting to be set free. I believe Paul would take all of that, and he would remind those of us who are believers that the gifts we have, all of them, are gifts given by the Holy Spirit for the common good. I think if Paul was here preaching today, he might say something like, "Beloved, brothers and sisters, I don't want you to be ignorant regarding gifts. You all have them. We all have them. And they are all apportioned by the Spirit and given along with the responsibility to use those gifts to make the entire world a better place." Get out there and do it. Get out there and do it.